Hello. We had left off last time with the fact that around 1805, 1804, France and England went back to war. And once again, the United States wanted to say neutral. We don't care about the war. We don't know what they're fighting over. We don't care what they're fighting over. We don't want to get involved in any of these European political fiascos, but they both want to get our trade away from their enemy. So to do that, Napoleon in 1806 issued two different decrees that he just issued a decree. I mean, as far as we're concerned, the whole thing is illegal. What he's doing is a violation of international law, violation of neutral rights, but he just did it. He just issued a decree, one of them while he was in Berlin, and the other while he was in Milan, Italy. He was involved in a war throughout Europe, and he was traveling around a lot. And so those were known as the Berlin Decree and the Milan Decree. And what they said was that the French Navy had the right, and where did they get the right? Napoleon just said so. They had the right to stop the trade of any country trying to trade with France's enemy, England, or any of its allies in Europe. So England responded with what were called the Orders in Council. This was some royal body in England, and it was called the Council and the Privy Council. And so they just issued the Orders in Council, which said basically that the English Navy was authorized to stop any trade with France or any of its allies in Europe. And basically, that meant that all of Europe, England, and so forth, were all now theoretically off limits to trade with the United States. If we traded with one side, we'd be running into the English Navy, and if we traded with the other side, we'd be running into the French Navy. And they're both out there enforcing those rules that they've made up. So this is a real problem for President Jefferson. What are we going to do about this whole thing? How can we preserve American neutrality? How can we protect our right to obey what we thought were international laws? International law is a very complicated subject, and it's hard to know exactly what it is. It's sort of like a system that, well, that's what people have been doing, so that's what you can do. It's very complex. And we said that all of those measures, the two from France and the one from England, were violations of international law. And they all had some fancy legalistic argument for explaining why, no, they were legal and they had the right to do that. So what to do? Well, in December of 1807, just before the end of the calendar year, Jefferson asked Congress to pass, and Congress did pass, what was known as the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act. And what this did was to say that the United States would not trade with anybody. We were not allow any American ship to enter or leave an American port. We're going to cut off trade altogether. And the idea is that this would put so much economic pressure on both England and France that they would have to repeal their measures, which we considered violations of neutral rights and international law. The embargo was so strict, it cut off trade with England and all of its allies. It cut off trade with France and all of its allies. It cut off all trade with any neutral countries in Europe. I don't know if anybody was very neutral. Maybe like Denmark or something. Not very much neutrality. Most of all of Europe was either an ally of England or an ally of France. But if there was anybody, and I'm not sure that there was, we couldn't trade with them. We couldn't trade with the West Indies because a lot of them are either colonies of France or colonies of Britain, but even other parts of the West Indies that were not affected, we couldn't trade with that. We couldn't even trade with ourselves. A lot of American commerce went by sea. I mean, the only way to ship stuff from one port of America to another was by sea. For all intents and purposes, we didn't have any roads for land transportation of products going from one state to another. Almost everything went by sea, and it was sometimes called the coasting trade. The coasting trade, because it would go along the coast. If you wanted to ship something from Boston to Philadelphia, you went by sailboat from one port to another along the east coast. So it's called the coasting trade, and that also was illegal. Now, Jefferson knew, and Congress passed the law. Congress in December of 1807 passed the Embargo Act. Jefferson knew this was going to hurt America's economy. I mean, he understood that. But he said, or he was thinking, that it would hurt us, but it would hurt England and France more. And that, yeah, all we'd have to do is, just suck it up for a period of time, bite the bullet, cut off our trade, and it'll be so devastating to them that they will change their ways and respect our neutral rights and revoke their obnoxious measures. He is thinking that, what is it that we import from them? What is it that we export to them? And a simple answer, and just to get it in a few words, is that we import manufactured goods and we export agricultural goods, raw materials. And that's what our trade is. We're a producer of a wide range of raw materials, many of them agricultural products. We're the great farming nation of the world, and so we export a lot of farm goods, aka food, and then we import most of our manufactured goods because we have basically no manufacturing establishment of our own. Well, what do you need more? Manufactured goods or food? Well, Jefferson thought they need food. They need us more than we need them. So we'll be able to impose this embargo for hopefully a short period of time, and it'll do the job, and both England and France will say, oh my God, we need to get our trade with the United States back again, and they will repeal their measures. It didn't work. The American economy was hurt very badly. The act was extremely unpopular. People sometimes refer to it, you kind of have to look at the word. They spell it backward, embargo, and then it would become oh grab me. And so it was called the oh grab me law. There was a certain amount of smuggling. Americans know how to smuggle. They're pretty good at that. They've got experience in smuggling. So there's some violation of law. And politically, it was very, very unpopular. And I told you that the Federalist Party has been out of office ever since the election of 1800. And the party has generally been losing strength. There's still Federalists around, and they had some power in some local governments. There were, especially in New England, there were some state legislatures that were run by Federalists and some Federalist governors and so forth. As I say, especially in the New England area, federalism was kind of popular. Nationwide, it had been out of office and sort of losing strength, gradually, slowly fading away. But the Embargo Act was so unpopular that it kind of gave a new life to the Federalist Party, and all of a sudden the Federalists are much more active, and they were very strong in their condemnation of this Republican measure this Republican economic disaster, which they're trying to take advantage of politically. So the whole thing was a disaster. And in fact, in 1809, now in 1808 there's an election. Madison was elected as president. As soon as he became president in March of 1809, Madison had to yield to the unpopularity of the Embargo Act, and Congress repealed it. A failure and a real disaster for the United States. All right, so the Embargo Act is off the books, but the Berlin and Milan decrees are still there and still being enforced by France, and the Orders in Council are still on the books in England and being enforced by the British Navy. So we got to do something about those. So Madison came up with another law that he asked Congress to pass called the Non-Intercourse Act, later in 1809. The law was still an embargo on trade with England and France, but it was limited to England and France themselves. It didn't apply, it wasn't as broad, it wasn't as all-encompassing as the Embargo Act had been. It allowed the coasting trade, it allowed us to trade with other neutrals, it allowed us to trade with some parts of Latin America and so forth, even though maybe they were tied to England and France. But just in general, it was not as strict, it was not as harsh as the Embargo Act had been. And Madison's hope was that this would be so less effect on the economy, it wouldn't be so economically disastrous for the United States, and we could get it to work. But again, he was wrong. This was, again, very unpopular. It's giving a real boost to the Federalist Party, which is sort of like revived at a time when it looked like it was headed for oblivion. And politically, the Non-Intercourse Act was almost as unpopular as the Embargo Act had been. And so again, Congress had to repeal it under a lot of political pressure. So Congress again restored trade, allowed the United States to trade wherever they wanted. But we still got the problem of the English measures. They're still not respecting our neutral rights. Neither France nor England were acting to allow us what we felt was our legal right under international law. So in 1811, Congress passed a third law to try to deal with the issue, but it took a little bit of a slightly different tack onto the whole issue. It's called Macon's Bill Number 2. I'll put this in writing with all of the notes that I always provide for you to accompany the lectures. And don't worry about how it got there. It's a long story. Just take the name for what it is. It was called Macon's Bill Number 2. And it's kind of like thinking about applying maybe a positive incentive instead of a negative one. Instead of trying to punish them for England and France for having this, we took a different approach. We said that we would allow trade to resume with both of them, but that if one of them were to repeal their measure, that we would then impose we would impose an embargo against the other side. So it's sort of like using a carrot instead of a stick. We're giving them an incentive that if you will remove your measure that we think is illegal, then we will punish your enemy by imposing an embargo against them, and that way you can get us to stop trading with them without having to go through your navy or anything. We'll stop trade if you will repeal your measure and acknowledge our neutral right. That's what we're after. We're after an admission of legal right to trade. Well, in early 1812, Napoleon tricked us. Napoleon issued, or some French diplomat, it wasn't anything from Napoleon, but a French diplomat somewhere in Europe met with an American diplomat and presented him with a document which he said was a decree by Napoleon repealing the Berlin and Milan decrees. It was a fake. No such decree had been issued by Napoleon. But the United States thought that it was. So we reimposed an embargo against England. And we waited then to see if England would act, if they would respond and say, okay, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to do the same, so that you will also cut off your trade with France. And we hoped that England would respond, and they did not. England still refused to repeal its orders in council. So in June of 1812, President Madison sent a message to Congress asking for a declaration of war against England. And he cited two main reasons why we needed to go to war against England. And the first one was what I've been talking about, this whole issue of trade and their refusal to respect America's neutral rights. He went to some length to explain how we've tried to negotiate this, and he went through the whole history of what we've done. It's a lot more complicated than I've been giving here in class. I've just been giving you a very summary view of this, but all the things we've been through, what we've done, and how England responded, and trying to show how England has consistently failed to and refused to recognize our right as a neutral to trade with everybody. The second reason is somewhat related, and so these two reasons are sometimes referred to as the maritime reasons. The second reason also relates to our trade. It's another issue that I haven't talked about yet, but it's something that has been going on between us and England ever since the war began. England had a policy for its navy called impressment. The English Navy had done this forever. The Navy had trouble getting personnel to serve, especially during a time of war. People did not just rush to join the Navy. It was extremely dangerous work. Even in peacetime, service in the Navy was very hazardous. Going to sea is a hazardous occupation to this day. You know, even with all of our modern technology and radar and everything else, ships go down at sea. Fishing boats coming out of San Pedro or whatever are lost at sea, and a boat will sink and people were killed. It's dangerous to go to sea. In the English Navy of the early 19th century, the captains were virtually gods on their ship. The captains were subject to no restrictions, no restraints. Captains were absolute masters of what they wanted to do. They could do anything on their ship with their crew and punish it any way they wanted. And if in the course of punishment they happened to go a little too far and kill a crew member, well, too bad. There was no penalty attached to the captain. There were no rules limiting them. And some English Navy captains were absolute psychopaths, and they would just deliberately punish their crew mercilessly, and the crew had no recourse. So that's really, really tough. And that's true, as I said, even in peacetime. But in wartime, service in the Navy became much worse. Naval warfare in the 19th century consisted sort of trying for the ships to try to negotiate and to get into a good position and to just blast the other side with all of the guns they had and just try to blast them as far as they can out of existence. Ships became very heavily damaged in battle. The English Navy would paint the decks of their ships red as kind of a psychological trick to minimize the visual impact of all the blood that would be running around in combat. The ships had a crew member, usually a young guy, a midshipman, whose job it was to run around with bags, with buckets of sand and throw it on the decks in places so that people wouldn't slip and fall, and all the blood and guts that were scattered around on the decks once the shooting started. It was just horrible. It was horrible. And nobody wanted to do that. So the English Navy, they couldn't fill their crews because they just couldn't get the people to volunteer. So the Navy had a form of forced service called impressment. The English Navy could send out a crew member. Well, they'd send an officer with a detachment of a half a dozen or so sailors called a press gang that would find people and press them into service. And they could just go up to anybody and say, hey, you're in the Navy. You've been pressed into service in the Navy. And so one of the goals of young men when the Navy was at war was to avoid press gangs at all costs. You don't even, if you see a group of men that look like they might be a press gang, get out of there, go hide somewhere, because if they press you, it's like a death sentence. English towns in rural areas used to assign watch guards 24/7 to stand and watching any roads leading into town, and if they saw some people coming in, a group of half a dozen men just kind of seemed like they're marching along that might be a press gang, get the word out so all the young men in town could go hide, because impressment was it's like a death sentence. Now, the Navy could and did go into rural areas and press strong young men that looked like they could do the work of serving on a ship. They could press those guys into service, and they did, but they would prefer not to. Those people wouldn't know anything about sailing a ship, wouldn't know how to hoist a sail, wouldn't know how to tie a knot. They would go after experienced sailors, people who were working in commercial shipping as crew members aboard merchant ships, and they would go there and just get some of the crew members because those guys were experienced sailors. Obviously, they couldn't take the entire crew because that would put a merchant out of business, shut down the ship. So they could only take a limited number of members off of any ship. So there were restrictions on who they could press. But English merchant sailors, who were civilians working aboard commercial ships, many of them just left. I mean, they just, I want to get out of here because if I stick around here in an English port, taking on a cargo or something, and the Navy shows up and presses me, I'm gone. So they go leave their jobs and go elsewhere. Well, where would they go? Well, many of them got jobs on American ships, commercial ships, who were looking for personnel, looking for crew members, and they'd end up working there. So the English Navy would stop ships at sea and go aboard and look for men to press. And theoretically, they could only press British subjects, but they just didn't care. I mean, people don't have IDs. There's no such thing as an ID. They just go aboard and they just look for anybody that looked like he was a strong, healthy young guy that could climb up the ladders and up the ropes and set a sail and do whatever needs to be done aboard a ship in those days. And they were just pressing people, including Americans. And we have records of something like, I think, 700 American sailors got pressed into the English Navy. And I don't know if we know, maybe people have done research on this and tried to find out how many of those people survived, but the survival rate in the English Navy was not good. So we claim that this is a violation of basic human rights. Forced military service into the Navy of a foreign nation is, as far as the U.S. is concerned, a violation of basic human rights. So we've been arguing about this, against this, for a long time, ever since the war began. One reason that Jefferson originally made the Embargo Act apply to even ships engaged in the coasting trade was because he was trying to protect American sailors against impressment. And the British Navy would come up along the coast and they would stop a ship and go aboard and say, okay, here, you and you, come aboard, you're joining our crew. And we've argued that this is just wrong. This is just a violation of rights. And we got nowhere. The English Navy realized that if they don't have impressment, they don't have a navy. So they just would not yield. So, in fact, as I said, hundreds of Americans have been impressed and sent off to a very uncertain future. And President Madison, in his message to Congress, denounced that and used that as another reason why we needed to go to war against England. Neutral rights and sailors' freedom, both sort of related, both relating to trade. So those were the two main reasons that Madison cited. And I have to tell you, I hate to say this about a president of the United States, but that was less than honest. President Madison was kind of making a political statement there that was not totally upfront. There were actually other reasons why we went to war. Certainly those two issues were very important and they were very serious matters of dispute between us and England. But there were other things that were really maybe more important, more pressing reasons, but things that for political purposes Madison didn't want to mention. He didn't want to make a big deal about these other issues. And what he's trying to do is to emphasize these maritime issues because the idea was that the states where these maritime issues would have the biggest impact were those of New England and the North, where trade was very important to our economy, where local communities depended on trade, and he's trying to convince them that we should go to war against England because it's in their interest. And the reason he was trying to do that was because, in fact, in the northeastern part of the country, especially in the New England states, there was very, very strong opposition to going to war. The whole idea of war was very unpopular in the Northeast. The various trade measures, the Embargo Act or the Non-Intercourse Act, had been unpopular throughout the country, but very much so in the Northeast. The main area of opposition was the Northeast. And so Madison is trying to get support from that section because he knows there's great opposition to the war there. And as I said, that's where the Federalist Party still had some possibilities, it still had some ties, and it's gaining strength significantly as a result of opposition to the Republican war measures and now to the Republican war itself. In contrast, the war had a good deal of support in the South, so this has become kind of a sectional issue where the North is anti-war and the South is pro-war, but the big support for the war was from the American West. western parts of the coastal states, and then some of the new states that have been added in the West. By this time, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio and Louisiana have become states. We've got 4 western states, and then we have western districts of the original 13 states along the coast. And in those western areas, there's very, very strong support for the war. And Madison realizes that there's a sectional issue here, and he needs to downplay the Western support for the war in order to avoid antagonizing the Northeast. You know, I mean, people in the Northeast argue, we go to war against England, the English Navy is going to shell our homes. The English Navy is going to shell Boston, it's going to shell Newport, Rhode Island, it's going to shell ports in Connecticut, New Haven, and so forth. They're not going to shell Pittsburgh. The British Navy is not going to be a threat to these towns that are starting to spring up in the west of the mountain areas as Americans start to settle that. It's fine for them to have a war. It's not going to hurt them. It's going to hurt us. So the war is a very divisive political issue, and Madison realizes that, and his message asking for war exploits that or takes advantage of that. So my question now is why was the war so popular in the West? Well, Westerners want to go to war against England for a very simple, basic American reason. They want additional land. They are out for more land to expand. They're out for more land for Americans to settle. They're out for more land for American land companies to maybe get their hands on a bunch of land and sell it at a great profit to themselves. They want additional land. And I say, well, wait a minute. We just bought Louisiana. We just bought the Louisiana Territory. We haven't gotten any settlement there. Within the areas of sort of what we might call the Old Northwest, the original area from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, we're settling that fairly rapidly, and as I said, there's a couple states out there and other areas on their way to statehood, but there's a lot of land left. Why do we want more land? What do we want specifically? Well, there were, in the debates in Congress, in the discussions in Congress that have been going on for several years, congressmen from the West had mentioned 2 areas of land that they felt we should get, that somehow we were entitled to additional land. And the 2 areas they've talked about were Florida, which has had sort of a complicated history. It's back under Spanish control, and Spain is sort of an unwilling ally of France. Napoleon, I told you, just kind of took over France and put his brother as the king. So that's not the issue of we're going to war, but we do want Florida. But more to the point, we want Canada. American congressmen have been saying that we should get Canada. Ever since the independence, there have been Americans who have been arguing that somehow Canada was naturally a part of the United States. That Canada had been British colonies, we had been British colonies. We had all been subject to the same oppression, as Americans called it that, from the British monarchy. King George III was much of a tyrant towards Canada as he had been to us, and so that they naturally would think of themselves as sort of part of us. We're right next to each other on the same continent. we just sort of assumed that Canadians would want to be part of America. And so that argument has been expressed by many members of Congress, especially after the election of 1810. In the election of 1810, there were a number of young congressmen elected from the West, either western districts of the main eastern states or from the new western states. A number of they're all Republicans, they're all part of the Republican Party. And one name that I'll tell you about more later, I mean, that he's going to be talking about is a guy named Henry Clay, who's from Kentucky. But there are other Western congressmen that are sometimes called the War Hawks. They were referred to that at that time because they've been on record for a couple of years here when Madison is declaring war. For the past couple of years, there have been these War Hawks in Congress advocating war with England in order to acquire Canada. So there's that support. There's another issue that these Western congressmen are talking about. Yeah, we already have a lot of that land. We have substantial land that we've barely begun to settle. We're just starting to take over some of that land in the old Northwest. But as of 1810, 1812, we're having trouble settling that land. And the reason is, if some of you may be thinking about it, what's been going on, the reason is that Indians are finally standing up to American expansion. And the key here is that the Indians have a great leader who is trying to unite them, a guy named Tecumseh, who's a member of the Shawnee tribe. And Tecumseh was a very bright guy, a very dynamic leader, a very sort of charismatic figure. Sometimes kind of reminds me of George Washington. I talked a little bit about how George Washington was just a very inspirational leader. People just trusted him. People just respected him. The same is true of Tecumseh. And many of the Indians were sort of suspicious of him because as a Shawnee, the Shawnee were a very warlike tribe who often went out against other Indians and took their land and took their people and so forth. They're sort of a very rough tribe of Indians. But Tecumseh is trying to convince them, look, forever, Native Americans have been defeated by Europeans using a divide and conquer strategy. This goes back to the days of Cortez and his defeat of the Aztecs. One of the reasons why Cortez managed to defeat the Aztecs back in 1521, that he had a lot of Indian allies on his side, Indians who were opposed to the Aztecs, and he enlisted them to support him against the Aztecs. And many Indians joined the Spaniards because they thought, hey, they're going to free us from Aztec control. And then once the Aztecs had been defeated, then Cortez turned around and took over his former Indian allies. And so, the divide and conquer strategy worked, and it had been used in more recent times in North America as well. The original Iroquois Confederation of upstate New York had been divided by Europeans, and somehow the French and the English managed to convince different members of the Iroquois Confederation. Some of them ended up joining France and supporting France, and some ended up supporting England, and they went to war against each other during the 7 Years' War. That was a war between England and France, but a lot of the fighting was done by Indians, by allies of the English and allies of the French, fighting against each other. So English allies and French allies fought a war, and the winner was Europeans. And Tecumseh is trying to convince people that we've got to stop this, that we've got to assert our rights as Native Americans, assert our excuse me, assert our rights to this land. We own land that they're trying to take away from us. We've got to stop that. And slowly but surely, he's gaining support. Slowly but surely, the Tecumseh Confederation is gaining ground, and the Indians are posing for one short time there great resistance and successful resistance to American takeover of their land. There are settlers who had gone out. There had been a line that had been agreed by back in 1794, a line dividing the West into areas where the Indians accepted American takeover, but that they said west of that would still be preserved for Indians. Americans are settling west of the line. The U.S. Army established a fort at what basically the site of present-day Chicago, and the settlers are being killed. The Fort Dearborn on the site of Chicago was destroyed by an Indian attack, and the soldiers, they were all killed. So the Indians are very strongly mobilized and are halting American expansion. This is the standard American strategy that I've talked about is force the Indians west, force the Indians west. We've been doing that, and we've had a great deal of success at that. But as of 1810, we've run into an obstacle that we don't usually run into, and that is a united Indian opposition. And what the war hawks are claiming is that the Indians are in fact nothing more than puppets of the English government. They attribute this revival of Indian resistance to the English, overlooking the fact that all the Indians are trying to do is to protect their land that we have granted to them by treaty, and we don't ever like to, in this country, we have trouble with other countries or so forth, or other people, and we tend to blame them, and we don't look at our own flaws and our own reasons why people are not always happy with us. And that was this case here. We're going to blame the English rather than accepting responsibility ourselves. So for the reasons here of gaining Canada and suppressing Tecumseh, people in the West support war with England. But in the vote in Congress, Madison had the votes. The Republicans were definitely in a majority. Republicans from the West, Republicans from the South. Many of the congressmen from the Northeast were Federalists, but they were in a minority, and Congress approved the declaration of war. So we went to war against England. A few days later, the word arrived that in fact England had repealed the orders in council. The news had not reached the United States in time. You might say, well, okay, well, that's one of the reasons we've gone to war. It's no longer valid. We should call off the war. You could argue, in a sense, that there's been a war between England and France. Whose side should we take? And you could argue that we took the wrong side. I mean, we selected the country that we're going to be on their side, even though we did never have an alliance with France, but we're fighting on France's side, and France is the country that did not repeal their Berlin and Milan decrees. So, I mean, they still had those in effect, but we went to war against England, which did repeal its orders in council. So you could argue, kind of interestingly, that we went to war against the wrong country, that Napoleon outwitted us, and and the word didn't arrive from England. And you might think, well, then, hey, now that we know that the orders in council are no longer in effect, maybe we don't need to go ahead with the war. Yes, admittedly, the impressment was still a very serious issue. It was a very important matter, and that was still there. That had not been removed by England. But the real reasons we went to war were still valid. And this is why I think that in some ways these Western issues, as you might call them, as opposed to the maritime issues, are really more important. We still want that land, we still want Canada, and we still want to have a war against Tecumseh and his growing number of Indian allies. So we went to war. Well, our military strategy was based on the idea that we're going to invade Canada. I mean, that's what we want, and we expected that Canadians would join us. I mean, we had this understanding that we'd sort of held on to ever since the days of the Revolution, that the Canadians were like our natural allies, and we're both victims of English tyranny, so we both should join together and fight against England. So we made several invasions of Canada, hoping that and expecting that the Canadians would join us. We assumed that they would just rise up when American troops came into town and welcome us as conquering heroes, as liberating them from English tyranny. And that was sort of the basis of our military strategy. We're going to take Canada, which was what we want. That's what we're going to war, is to get Canada. And all we have to do is send American troops up there, send militia troops in, and the Canadians will say, thank God you're here to free us from English tyranny. And we expected that. And man, were we surprised. Canadians resisted very strenuously our invasions. Most of our military ventures into Canada were disastrous failures. We got our butts kicked pretty severely because Canadians did not want to be part of the United States. We seriously misjudged Canadian policy. We should have looked at this carefully. Who were the Canadians? Well, there's all of the French Canadians who don't necessarily have anything to do with the United States. There are a lot of English-speaking people in Canada, but one of the main reasons why English speakers had gone to live in Canada was to get away from the United States. During the Revolutionary War, many of the Loyalists, many of the Tories had left the United States under pressure from the Americans. During the war, Tories were very much tormented, very much harassed. Their property was confiscated. There were wars between the so-called patriots and the loyalists. And many of the loyalists had fled the country, either because they were forced out or they were threatened by being forced out. Those who could afford to go to England did. Many of them went down to the Caribbean, to English colonies there. But probably the most popular place for Tories to go was to Canada. So those are people who are in Canada because they don't want to be in the United States. So we severely misjudged Canadian response to our invasion, and our military strategy was a disastrous failure. We had other problems during the war that we should have known about but didn't. Remember we talked about the Bank of the United States, and one of the reasons Hamilton wanted it was so that if there was never another war, the government would be able to borrow money from the Bank of the United States, and that was a key part of his whole strategy back in 1791. But the bank had been chartered but for 20 years. So the charter had expired in 1811, just before the war began. And so there was no source of a bank from which we could borrow money. So we had a hard time getting money. We were trying to borrow it from this state bank, that state bank. It was very hard to find, and it just didn't work. we had the same problems getting money that we'd had in the Revolution. We had struggled to get financial support for our military operations. I mean, it was so, and the Republicans had never really been satisfied with the bank, so when the charter had expired, they had made no move to reestablish it. So it was ironic that here Hamilton wanted the Bank of the United States in case we ever needed it. We need it, and now the bank has just gone away. So that was a disaster. And another point is that resistance and opposition to the war from the Northeast remained very strong. Northeastern states were adamantly opposed to the war. They had never favored it. They had been anti-war from the beginning, and they remained strongly anti-war. So the country was badly divided over the war. And yes, most of the West, certainly the West and much of the South, were supporting the war. But there was strong opposition from the Northeast. So the war was dividing the country and was causing severe problems. So for a number of reasons, things are going badly for the United States. Now I'm going to stop now, and again, I'm not as far along as I would like to be, so we'll have to just pick up this same topic of the United States during the War of 1812 and dealing with the fact that things are not going well. Now, your questions for the lecture today are that Congress passed in 1807 the Embargo Act. What briefly were its provisions?